Is nuclear war, the prospect of a nuclear war, scary? The prospect of climate change impacts, is that scary? So that is what it is. Is if me getting a terminal diagnosis, is that scary? Yeah, it's scary. Okay, so it's not about policing and trying to say, oh, let's not go there. No, that's not a psychologically coherent way of engaging with these issues. It's really, again, about how do we practice holding the both and, or the yes and, which is this is scary and overwhelming, and here's what is possible. And I think that, again, our brains are designed to become, when we're aroused, when we're affectively aroused, AFFECT, when we're affectively aroused, a lot of things are happening on a neurochemistry level, which is we can lose access to our prefrontal cortex, which is where foresight, empathy, strategy, that is really what, we want to have access to. But when we become aroused, we tend to shut that down, and we go into very binary thinking of black and white. And again, this whole fear, hope, and despair debate is an expression to me of that. And I'm like, let's just get on with, like, please, like, I'm so tired of that. It's a waste of fucking time, people. Do not keep circling around like, should we have hope? What about despair? What about hope? Like, that in itself is an expression of the way that we get when we're freaked out. And it doesn't help to have all these public, conversations. It's just like feeding it. What we really want to be doing is looking at, how do we hold multiplicity together? How do we live with ambiguity? How do we live with paradox? How do we live with complexity? Because to your point in the beginning of the conversation, that is reality.
Climate change. We've never faced a greater threat. Yet all that we produce and consume inflates the debt of greenhouse gases we release. We feel them raise the temp, and the tempest we'll unleash will leave us weeping to forget, unless we take collective action, make a pledge to finally change our ways and keep climate change in check, to benefit the planet and all of its inhabitants. We know it can be done, so listen up and join the quest.
And climate change demands that we change everything that we do.
Chad's Climate Quest is brought to you by Regen Intel, activating humanity to become a planet-positive species. Find out more at www.regenintel.earth. Today, we have the privilege of hosting a truly exceptional guest, Dr. Renee Lertzman. Renee is a researcher, educator, and engagement strategist who translates relational psychological insights to change our approach to our planetary crisis. Applying her training as a psychosocial researcher, specializing in deep human insights, she designs frameworks and methods grounded in public health, clinical psychology, and neurosciences that guide people to take action and create impact on climate and sustainability issues. Working with a diverse range of clients, from Google to the World Wildlife Federation, Renee's unique approach to has redefined how we engage with and respond to our planet's challenges. Her work isn't just about understanding the interplay between our minds and the environment. It's about leveraging that understanding to create impactful, compassionate, and sustainable change. Today, she joins us to share her insights, experiences, and vision for a world where psychological awareness is at the heart of our response to climate change. Hi, Renee. It's great to have you on the show. Thank you for coming along my Climate Quest.
It's good to be here with you. Thank you.
Well, Renee, it's been such a pleasure getting to know you over the years. I recall first meeting you at a Google food event and almost instantaneously bonded and connected with you. This has been a kind of a theme across the podcast where, these almost seemingly serendipitous moments when you encounter folks in this space and have that instantaneous bond. And so it's such a pleasure to have you today on the show. And, Renee, many of our listeners are drawn to the personal side of people's stories who are in this space, and beyond just the professional, I don't want to say facade, but the professional space that we occupy. What is that personal journey that brought you to where we are today, brought you to where you are today? And so, could you share a little bit about how your personal experiences have shaped your own climate quest and led you to where you are today?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for having me. And I always love talking with you. I agree with you. Sometimes you just have that sense of, whatever it is, connection, chemistry, and things feel really easy. And I've always felt that way with you. So I'm excited to be here with you. So personal journey, it's always fun to be invited to reflect on this because, it's sometimes not always straightforward how we become who we are and what we do. But the story for me starts with, I think I'll go all the way back to when I was a child. And I was actually raised in the San Francisco Bay Area in the South Bay. So I went to college, high school in Palo Alto. I was exposed to, I didn't know my classmates at the time were, their parents were at Stanford and some of them were quite eminent. And so I was sort of in this atmosphere that was already pretty innovative in some ways around the thinking. And so there you have that. And then I was also in a culture, I'm Jewish, and I was raised as a Reformed Jewish person very culturally. And there was this theme in that tradition around what the term is tikkun olam, which is, it technically means to repair the world. Oh. And so when I think back to how did I come to do this work, it feels like this intersection of, where I was raised and what I was exposed to. And then let's bring in some trauma in the mix. So I had an emotionally difficult childhood. The family there was some addiction going on. There was some trauma and I sought therapy. So at age 15, I was taking myself to psychotherapy, and I, got a scooter and I got myself there and all of that. And that just, was a profound experience for me. And so I then, as a young person going to college, had in my mind, like, well, of course I'm going to be a psychologist, of course, because I had experienced directly the power of a psychotherapeutic relationship. And I also at that time was preoccupied with nuclear war. This was the late 1980s. I'm that Gen X. And so I had my own kind of existential concerns. So all of that, I found myself in college at UC Santa Cruz at the time, was very focused on, I'm a psychologist, that was my thing. And then I ended up taking, as one does, electives, and I enrolled in an environmental studies and sciences, one of those 101 lectures. And, I was frankly completely thrown by what I was learning about. It was very surreal to me to sit in a class in college learning about, each week, here's a different ecological crisis. And imagine at age 19 or 20, and you're learning about, oh, well, actually humans have, done, just enacted kind of unthinkable damage, not only to the biosphere and ecosystems, but other humans and populations and communities. So at that time, it was all kind of coming up, right? So what we're living in now is an expression of what was starting to come up in the 80s and late 80s around genocide, around, colonialization, around, all these things, normative ideas that we're raised with. And so there I was, and then I took this environmental studies class, and I was still taking all of my psychology major courses. So I was literally going between, okay, we're going to talk about climate change, we're going to talk about species loss, and then I would go over to my psychology classes. We're going to talk about the human mind, and we're going to look at, the psychology of, cognitive dissonance and the personality and all of that. And so to me, at that time, these things came together in a way where it was impossible for me to see that they weren't integral. And then I was confused why the environmental studies and the psychology departments weren't, it just seemed very bizarre to me. And so I then literally proposed, okay, I'm going to do my own major. I'm going to, I called it something like ecological consciousness because that was the language at the time. And then that's been my path ever since.
I mean, wow, I really appreciate that story. And first of all, thank you for being vulnerable and sharing your story and your story of your youth. And I think it's such a powerful statement of you taking action, even at that young age of 15, to find that scooter and going and getting that therapy. And it's something, a lesson that I think many of us can relate to in dealing with trauma in our young lives and taking that initiative. So thank you very much for being vulnerable there. And also, what's such a fascinating journey that brought you as an undergraduate. And something I don't think we've ever shared, Renee, is, I don't know if I told you, but when I first started undergraduate, I started as a psychology major.
Oh, wow.
And I actually, in a similar pathway, I started taking a lot of political science courses, economic courses, and started to see a lot of the disparities of our system there. And I started studying then international relations, and I ended up with creating my own program as well. So I mean, this is maybe there is a reason why we're also connecting here. We share similar storylines. But what I'm hearing from you is really, something I didn't understand until now is this has been something that has defined your life and career since the earliest of days. I mean, in my brain and knowing you for these years, for some reason I thought that, you've been working this for a long, long time, but this is really at the crux of your education, your academic and professional pursuits since the very beginning. And you've really been a trailblazer, I would say, in this field. I mean, if I were to think about the weaving in psychology and climate action, you're the first person that comes to my mind. And yet it also feels, at the same token, something relatively new.
Right.
And we're hearing it more and more and more in the last 2 years, I would say, 2-3 years. And part of it is probably because of your work and the foundation that you set. So I wanted to ask a little bit about how you feel you've seen your journey evolve in helping people understand the connections between psychology and the interplay of psychology and climate action. And then also in that, how do you see and perceive the next evolution of this leadership happening today?
Okay. Really good questions. So what you're describing is the kind of surreal experience of having been immersed in this my whole adult life, and the fact that now people have sort of caught on. What's coming to mind for me is a paper I did in 1993 called Ecological Trauma that I gave at a conference. It was one of those, I don't know if you remember, because we're similar ages, I think. Back in the early 90s, it was a very vibrant time where there was a lot of interdisciplinary environmental kind of humanities. So there were these conferences that maybe would be hosted by more of an eco-literary, but then they'd invite, business and law and medicine. And it was just like, so I gave a paper on linking environmental degradation and issues with trauma. And it was pretty much not well received, right? There was a couple of people who I remember to this day, anthropologists actually, who provided that input, like, you're onto something. This is actually, what you're saying is actually absolutely key. And so there were a few people along my journey who would resonate, and that would give me enough of a motivation and kind of affirmation, like, okay, I'm going to keep going. But by and large, I was kind of on my own. And then at the same time, this was in the context of eco-psychology. So in the early 90s, the movement, there was someone named Ted Rozak who, was in Berkeley, and he wrote a book called Voice of the Earth, which was in, I think that was the late 80s. I can't remember now, or 90 or 91. And so that kind of started to provide some language that people started catching on to. And it was mainly in the therapeutic circles. And so there were these books that came out on eco-psychology and ecotherapy and that kind of thing. And I knew that I didn't want to go down that path. I actually, for whatever reason, felt very strongly that whatever we can understand about the psyche and our relationship with ecological degradation has to be applied and practical and work for people in organizations. So, who knows why I felt so strongly about that, but that's how my orientation has been. And so in a way, I see my work as a bridge between those who do clinical work, including trauma work, and those who work on the ground on the front line, so to speak, of whether it's policy, whether it's business, government, like whatever. And so to me, my muse has always been clinical psychology, psychodynamic work. So to me, that's deeply inspiring. And yet it requires a certain level of translation and innovation. So I often like to say, hey, you want to talk about innovation? This is innovation right here. It's like, no, of course you can't just take a clinical psychology, set of insights and then like, what do you do with that? Like, no, you have to innovate, you have to practice, you have to experiment. So that's just been this kind of path, right, that I've been on. And along the way, so because I've been doing this so long, I really do have a unique bird's eye view of the field. Because I've seen the evolution of the thinking. And I think we've talked about this a bit. And, I've come up with ways of providing that through this. I have these quadrants, for example, which frankly are inspired by Ken Wilber's integral model. I didn't come up with the quadrants, but I was at a certain point where I was like, how do I tell this story of the way that we're approaching this intersection of psychology and climate and so forth? And so when I came across his quadrants, I kind of did some mapping. And so, I've been able to track the way that the thinking has evolved from, initially in the 80s, it was more behavioral, and the field itself was primarily being driven. So there's the eco-psychology over here. So let's put them over to this side. And then there's the more cognitive behavioral risk, a lot of decision psychology, risk psychology, like Paul Slovic in Oregon. And you've got, Tony Lazarowitz, who's now at Yale. And you have, people who are looking at, well, how do humans make decisions and how are we processing this? And so I was tracking that and I knew I wasn't resonating with that. Because again, as I mentioned, my muse is psychodynamic, psychoanalytic, trauma-informed work that's really much more like integrated and embodied. And so I was like, okay, there's that over there. And then I watched, all this work come out about attitudes. I'm like, that doesn't feel very juicy to me, like attitudes. It's like we're talking about the experience people are having that may not even be on a conscious level. So, okay, there's all this attitudinal research. And then we started seeing all this work coming out about how do we talk about the issue and how do we frame it? What's the language we're using? So that's the kind of like everyone got really on the bandwagon around framing and messaging. And then the Six Americas came out and, all that. And then I'm like, okay, there's that. And then design thinking came online with IDEO, really democratizing design thinking. And then it's like, oh, this is a design problem. All right, Paul Hawken comes out with his book where he literally says sustainability is a design problem. And so then you've got this whole movement of we're going to do labs and accelerators and hackathons and like attack it that way. And then meanwhile, all this really innovative work has been growing, coming out of the more emotional processing, uh, you know, again, it's very trauma informed. It's also social movement informed. It's, and then as to your point, in the past few years, just exploded that wide open, right? But it had started 2016 is when I got really busy, and I was being interviewed for, talking about, what was going on with Trump. And so there was like a level of trauma that had kind of came on the scene, and suddenly people who were not open to what I had to say were very open to what I had to say. And I suddenly started working with all kinds of groups around, like, what is, what does this all mean for us, and what's a different way forward? And so that's my quick kind of, overview of this trajectory. And here we are now, where we have an opportunity to take a more integrated approach that brings the gifts of all of those theories of change and approaches together. But right now, I don't think we're talking enough about that. We're still kind of in our camp of, it's about this. Oh no, it's about this. It's like, you know what I mean? And a lot of these events we go to, frankly, a lot of gatherings and events and convenings are, in my experience, sort of, they're really these theory of change. They're kind of, can be like a big theory of change, kumbaya.
Yeah.
Or a lot of like debating and fighting, but without even being able to name it. So an event like the Google Food Lab is a really good example, where you have really high caliber, incredibly thoughtful people coming together who are all representing their thing, food system change, regenerative ag, and then you've got the food technologist over here. You've got the people, you know what I mean? And they're all just kind of like, and no one's actually being able to say, whoa, let's take a step back. Like, where's the human in all of this? Where's the human psychology in all of this, right?
Well, I think that's such an important point that you make, and thank you for that description of how the field has evolved. And I think it's such an important point. Where is the human? Where's the human psychology in this? And frankly, in so much of the systems that we're operating in. And so first of all, of course, we're operating in a system that's fully integrated, right? I call it the system of systems, right? Everything is fully integrated, but we like to silo, whether we're talking about climate change, whether we're talking about environmental issues and sustainability, or frankly, anything is part of our system. And understanding that those silos don't actually exist in reality, that they're constructed by industry, by individuals, right? And so when you go to the Google Food Lab, I mean, that's a sustainability thing, but like how all those different disparate silos come together, that's really important. So how do we create the human psychology in these systems that we're operating in? How do we see the human psychology, and also see how the systems operate, the integrated systems operate as a whole on our human psychology? I think it's such an important question. And I think, when you were talking about this like evolution, and of course there's been so many folks who've been working and thinking in this space, and as you point out, many different ways to approach this issue from a psychological perspective, as you mentioned. I also think in the last couple of years, and what I was really referring to is what I've noticed on social media. I've noticed at these events that you and I go to so often, we hear your talk, but we hear other talks that talk about mental health. They talk about climate change, mental health, trauma, and climate anxiety. And it's much more, I feel, less from a psychological perspective, from a psychologist, than from an experiential, if you know what I mean. Like they talking about their own emotions, their own feelings. Yeah. And I think that's important.
People are very much in a place of processing and sense making. And so these events, I think, and I'm actually writing a book right now about precisely this phenomenon of the level of sense making that we're living in right now, and how do you navigate that and stay kind of clear and sane and grounded amidst all this, like, what's going on and how am I feeling and why am I feeling this? What are you feeling? It's like we're really swimming in all the feelings right now. And I think that this is why I believe it's very important to bring in some more literacy around the psychological domain we're in, as opposed to just being in that feeling, kind of awash in the experience of it. It's also why I feel very strongly that we need to have representation in this space, in the field, by psychological practitioners. And
I agree.
it's just like a huge missing piece. And I've been saying this for years now. Like, how is it that we have, we've got the technologists, the policy folks, the economics, the science, and where's the representation of people who actually have spent their lives understanding and studying the human psyche? And I don't mean just individual psyche. I mean social psychology, the human, and it turns out we actually know so much about the human psyche, and yet we're not really tapping into that. And it's a bit of a Gordian knot, because there's a reason why we're not tapping it. It's like it all relates to each other. The reason why we're siloed, the reason why we're not talking about it, is because there's some avoidance going on, which again is something that psychologists really understand so much about, which is the ways, their strategies that humans have for avoiding and navigating discomfort, threat, anxiety, and so forth. So we have to become ninja level at this point. I really feel strongly about that. It's like there's no excuse or time anymore. We've got to level ourselves up when it comes to understanding these psychodynamic processes that are playing out at the geopolitical level.
Well, I mean, I'm glad you're bringing this up, because it's really been present on my mind, and actually it's something I think you and I have chatted about several times in the past. But speaking of trauma and speaking about feeling and sense making in this space right now, and in the future, in the short term future, because there is built-in climate change that will continue over a number of years, right? It's if we ended emissions today, we could maybe shorten that period and recover. But there already is built-in emissions, and the trajectories that we're on suggest that there's going to be some catastrophic events happening as our Earth systems respond to the actions that humanity and our systems have created in the natural world. And when those catastrophic, we chatted about this, but I do believe within 5 to 7 years, as short as that, we may be experiencing some of these catastrophic events that I believe are going to be so traumatic on our collective human psyche that we have to change. We will have to change. There'll be no excuse. There'll be no option to not change that.
Right.
However, I'm concerned about how we deal and process with that trauma. How do we build up our capacity, our resilience now in the face of what we know is coming?
We need to be doing that right now. I mean, we're like yesterday. Yeah. We need to be, and this is actually why I created this Project Inside Out, set of tools. It's a experiment in that direction. We need to be, again, like developing and skilling up these capacities. And so there's incredible efforts underway that already are, right? So we know about amazing, there's so much happening right now. And, for example, there's a new initiative called Cops Squared that was started by someone named Gary Belkin, who created something called Billion Minds Project. And he's in New York, and he's coming out of the public health sector. And he is organizing this whole coalition of organizations around precisely what he calls, psychological resilience at the community level. How do we engage communities on the ground and developing kind of these competencies? And so we're looking at how to introduce this out at scale and all of that. It's all very fast moving. And so there's all kinds of, initiatives happening now. So one of the things I came out of that summer where we spent time together at Future Horizon, that summer I was at like, I don't know, 6 or 7 events. I'm still recovering. But I was able to kind of hop between these different kind of impact communities, right? And what I realized coming out is the role of curators and conveners right now has never been more important, right? And so I came out with this profound sense that we're dealing with a situation where there's still this kind of cadre of elite curators and conveners. And they themselves, like, we're all human. We all have our blind spots. We all have our limitations. How do we bring in the ability to again be more integrative into where people are going for their information or inspiration or development, that has this kind of involved? And so I'm thinking about these elites like Aspen or House of Beautiful Business or Davos, or it's like COP. Even I didn't go to COP, and I know there was a lot more than usual, but that's my question right now, is how do we break up this kind of hold on the way, that's shaping the way we're approaching and thinking about these issues. We've got to somehow get out of.
I think that's such an important point. I mean, really. And I also did not go to the last 2 COPs in protest. For those listeners, the Conference of Parties, the UNFCCC's, it's a big climate conference that happens every year. And I typically go, I'm sure you go to many of them, but the last 2, I just couldn't go to the hypocrisy of the process and where it was being located, and just felt wrong. And I think you're right in that respect of how do we create these convenings and help support convenings that aren't a convening of the elites. I mean, we need to have convenings that are ubiquitous so that we can all be coming together in our communities and all over the world that don't require a threshold of economic wealth in order to attend, to be participant in, and to have any kind of voice in. So I think that is really an important way for us to be able to have the processing that we need, right? Because I think the question really is about how do we build up that shore of resilience for what we know is coming. It's not going to happen if we, for the billions of people aren't going to build up that resilience that's going to be needed by seeing, hearing what happens on our social media feed at COP or at Davos. I mean, we need to have a ubiquitous number of convenings to understand and learn about these issues, and also to share our experiences. And I hope that's a process of building up resilience.
Right. That's why I mean, that is related to why I created this project Inside Out, which is, it's kind of amazing. It should be more well known. So if anyone listening who wants to support this work, get in touch with me. It literally is designed to be a playbook for anyone who wants to be a more effective change maker through the lens of what it means to be a guide. And that includes convening. It includes just having some baseline of how to be a convener, how to facilitate. Facilitation, I've learned working with some pretty elite organizations, which I won't name, that are known to be super smart. And they are like the elite of the companies. And I get in there and I realize so many people who are so smart and accomplished have not necessarily learned how to facilitate a meeting or to facilitate a group process. And that is what is an example of a baseline competency that we should be, and scaling, to your point, to really create the opportunity for people to convene in a whole variety of contexts and cultures and regions that lead to the best outcomes, right? So again, it kind of comes back to me over and over again to what can we learn from public health sector? What can we learn from group psychology that we can distill? What are those skills and competencies, and get them out to people, get them in the hands? And right now, projectinsideout.net it's just available for whoever. But what I'm needing to do and wanting to do is take it to the next level of how to bring it to life, right? And actually create, whether that's a platform or I don't know right now, but it needs to be out and people need to be able to engage. But that was the intention of that work.
And it's such a powerful tool. And I know we've talked at times about, integrating some of the Project Inside Out work and methodology, even into our own Regen Intel education platform and the training and the work that we do with our organizations. With Regen Intel, we work a lot with we call it regional transformations, our consulting services or advisory services. And I think it's really about education. And it's not a traditional consulting model where we're producing reports. It's how do we educate organizations to be more effective leaders in a regenerative system? And I think what you're talking about with Project Inside Out is such an important part of that process of being a regenerative leader, right? It's not just being a hero or being a manager. It's like, how can I, in whatever role I play, be a leader? And I think we all have that capacity to do that if we have the right tools. I mean, that's the thing. We don't all need to be heroes, but we all can be leaders in our own lives.
Really beautiful reframe. And that's entirely what the premise of this work is about. And the work I do in organizations, I usually partner with a team inside an organization. And then they go through a training. The whole idea is to get it out of this notion that it has to be owned and run by, if you have sustainability in your job title, or if the sustainability team or the CSO team or the, if you're a founder, no, it's actually, if you care, which I believe every human does, if you care, then there's an opportunity you have to be some kind of leader in your respective realm, whatever that might look like. But I stand by the work in Project Inside Out 100%. I feel like it's interesting because I feel like it's so durable, and so it's like it's the real deal, because it's what it is a distillation of a lot of wisdom. No one made anything up here, right? Like, I didn't come up with the concept of attunement. It's like, it's really about that distillation and synthesis that I stand 100% on, as this is the evidence-based, like it's like on top of like mountains of evidence-based work. So I don't need, I'm just like, look, you can use it or you cannot use it, but I'm telling you right now, it's going to make you so much more effective. And so, but you have to, the thing I've also learned is you have to experience, it has to be experiential, right? It can't just be just mental, conceptual, cognitive, like, oh yeah, I love the idea of guiding. No, you have to go on a journey to really look at your own theory of change, to be able to look at, how am I showing up? One of the tools in Project Inside Out is where I invite you. I think you went through this in the workshop. What kind of change maker am I? Am I a cheerleader? Am I an educator? Am I a writer where I'm telling everyone what the right thing is to do? Or am I a guide? And just that simple activity that I did at, House of Beautiful Business, it's like that can turn on a light for people to say, oh my gosh, I've been showing up like a cheerleader and no wonder people keep shutting me down, So again, it's like really building that muscle of self-awareness.
Yeah. I think when I did that workshop, I found myself aligned with all of them, right? Steering different ways to all of them. But and so for our listeners, please do check out Project Inside Out. It's a really wonderful a framework for exactly as Renee is saying, building up the skills and tools that you need to be more effective leaders, and it also is a great framework to be integrating with other learning and education platforms. I want to steer a little bit into another line, if I can, Renee, around understanding a little bit more about the feelings, the emotions around climate anxiety that I think our listeners are really wanting to wrap their heads around. And I think this relates to like how you build the resilience. There are these tools, but then I want to get a little bit more into like what are these? Why are we feeling this? And I often feel like the narrative around we've talked about this. This has been ubiquitous. It's part of my message for like the last decade. The narrative around climate change is so centered on fear, so centered on problem and conflict. I mean, this is, and in fact, this is kind of the cauldron that the recipe for apathy and indifference throughout the entire system, not only climate, but the systems we're operating in. And I feel like we need to be grounded in the reality, but I often have this narrative of moving beyond those fear-based narratives to possibility, solutions. I mean, this has been my message for a long time. But I'm wondering around the psychology of this, the psychology around, fear-based messaging versus, positive or solutions-oriented possibility as a framework. And from your perspective, what is the role? What role does fear play in motivating action? Does it? Is it something that? And why is our systems predicated on fear? Not just climate, but again, our whole system, I believe, is predicated on fear of scarcity, fear of being alone, fear of being unable to provide your basic necessities. I mean, this is the model of an extractive, exploitative, scarcity-based system, and climate change. Why does this exist in our system, and does this play any role in motivating action?
So a few thoughts on this. One is just immediately, I'm just thinking, I would love to see some conversations happening with psychologists who really do specialize in fear and the psychology of fear. Like, where are they at the TED countdown?
Right.
I'm not like dissing on TED, so just to be clear, but I'm just saying, like, where are these perspectives? Because you're framing up like this is what we really need to be looking at. So I'm going to reflect my take on this, but it's not necessarily the ultimate take on this. My take is one thing I mentioned earlier, we actually know a great deal about the neuroscience of emotion and how it informs the way we relate and process the world. So this question about, is fear motivating? And should we be bringing in the fear? It's like, in a way that feels like a distraction. Really, the question is, how do we tell the truth? How do we look at the truth in a way that is most conducive to our capacity to really stay present with it and be with it, metabolize it, and then respond? And, and obviously it's not respond like, it's like responsiveness, like it's ongoing, right? So pick nuclear war, right? Like, is nuclear war, the prospect of a nuclear war, scary? It's pretty damn scary, right? Okay, now it's not about, whether or not it's scary, right? It's like climate change, the prospect of climate change impacts, is that scary? It's pretty, I just really want to swear.
You can.
It's really fucking scary. Okay. So that is what it is. Is if me getting a terminal diagnosis, is that scary? Yeah, it's scary. Okay, so it's not about policing and trying to say, oh, let's not go there. No, that's not a psychologically coherent way of engaging with these issues. It's really, again, about how do we practice holding the both and or the yes and, which is this is scary and overwhelming, and here's what is possible. And I think that, again, our brains are designed to become, when we're aroused, when we're affectively aroused, AFFECT, when we're affectively aroused, a lot of things are happening on a neurochemistry level, which is we can lose access to our prefrontal cortex, which is where foresight, empathy, strategy, that is really what, we want to have access to. But when we become aroused, we tend to shut that down, and we go into very binary thinking of black and white. And again, this whole fear, hope, and despair debate is an expression to me of that. And I'm like, let's just get on with, like, please, like, I'm so tired of that. It's a waste of fucking time, people. Do not keep circling around like, should we have hope? What about despair? What about hope? Like, that in itself is an expression of the way that we get when we're freaked out. And it doesn't help to have all these public, conversations. It's just like feeding it. What we really want to be doing is looking at, how do we hold multiplicity together? How do we live with ambiguity? How do we live with paradox? How do we live with complexity? Because to your point in the beginning of the conversation, that is reality. Mm-hmm. You said we're living in these complex systems. That is the nature of reality, mutually influencing, dynamic system. So that's how reality is. And so how do we cultivate these capacities to be with that? So this is a whole kind of detour around to come back to this question about climate anxiety. How do we navigate these experiences people are having? And so to circle back, it's very important. Everything I'm about to say is grounded in all the evidence-based research, so I'm not going to cite it. It's very important that we name our feelings and experiences, that in itself has an effect of what Dan Siegel calls name it to tame it. Okay, Daniel Siegel, right, has written tons of books on interpersonal neurobiology. If you pick up one of his books and apply it to climate change, your whole perspective could change. So we already know a lot about, like, okay, name it to tame it. We have to basically say, this is what I'm feeling. I'm feeling some fear. I'm feeling anxiety, and that in itself is really powerful. So what we're seeing now is a lot of people coming out and saying, I'm having climate anxiety. I'm feeling really overwhelmed. Now, you don't just stop there, right? You don't just kind of stay mired in that. If the conditions are right, which is ideally in group settings and kind of small groups especially, then people have this capacity to then pretty quickly move on.
Yeah.
To what are we going to do? What are we going to do? What am I going to do? It happens, like, it's just how we operate. But first, we need to touch and acknowledge what is actually being experienced right now. So you can't bypass. And a lot of these communities I see out there in the kind of solution space are engaging in a form of bypassing. And they're bypassing partly because it's a strategy, and they're bypassing because there's a lack of actual understanding of psychology. And I'm talking about, I don't care who you are and what elite position you have at what university with one big endowment. Like, I don't care. You could be an expert in economics. It doesn't mean that you understand the psychological dimensions. And that's where I'm saying we need to diversify the kind of perspectives here, right? So anyway, so I'm saying that there's a bypassing that happens, which I have a lot of compassion for, but it's not helpful to just be rah, solution, 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 if you're not acknowledging, wow, like, wow, this is really fucking big. This is really overwhelming. I don't even know how to think about this. I'm short circuiting right now. I don't even know if I can function thinking like all of that is really important to be able to have permission to name that and to honor that. And then you move into, all right, like here we are. We're in this really very inspiring community of regenerative leadership. What do we want to do? So it's like, that's what I want to see us scale in all kinds of communities, schools, all kinds of efforts around the world where people have that moment to reflect and say, wow, this is big. I feel scared. Okay, now what are we going to do about it?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And as somebody who's often considered to be one of the chief solutionists and the people who talk about solutions all the time, folks are always assuming that I am the most optimistic solution. I said, did you read my work or do you listen to my? Because what I always say is we need to be grounded in the reality of what's actually happening and understand that before we could even hope to have, to really envision that future. Because if we are, we're ostriches putting our heads in the sand. We can't do that, right? We have to be grounded.
Right.
And we're seeing that though. We're seeing either one or the other, and we're not seeing that. So I really appreciate your referring that. And it's, to be a solutionist, to be really focusing on solutions, you have to be standing on solid ground of reality. What's actually happening on a psychological level to you as a person, I think, but also to the organizational psychology, but also, with the reality of what's happening in our natural systems. We oftentimes, the solutions ignore and get distracted and bypass and go into, we can just solve everything. And we can't solve everything the speed that we need. We have to be grounded in that reality. So I really appreciate that framing. And I also wanted to ask the flip side of this. So certainly there's part of the discourse around climate anxiety, I don't think, as you point out, really gets us to that stage of, okay, now let's go do it. I think it's still miring in the anxiety. So let's sit in that anxiety and not coming out of it. Or the ostrich at the head in the sand saying just solutions. And there still isn't that connection, which I love that your work is so centered on that. And I'm also curious, though, there's not a lot of talk, or I think in the climate space, of the mental health benefits of a regenerative system, of the solutions themselves. So when we think about the cascading benefits of the solutions that solve for climate and for biodiversity, preservation and human health and well-being, what are the mental health benefits and impacts? Positive impacts of these systems. I don't hear that.
I know. It's so weird to me that you have these, again, it feels like these silos of research where the space of interpersonal neurobiology or social neuroscience is so dynamic. It's so rapidly evolving. So you have people like Hannah Critchlow, who has a book, Joined Up Thinking, and you've got Jamil Zaki, who runs the social neuroscience lab at Stanford, and you have all of this really compelling research about belonging, about connection, about people need to feel like they're part of something, and that so there's all that over there. It just hasn't yet made its way to the climate space. It hasn't yet gotten there. And that's what I'm trying to join the dots. So I reach out to people like Lisa Feldman Barrett or Hannah Critchlow or Dan Siegel. And it's like, hey, do you know how relevant your work is for the biggest existential threats facing the planet? And a lot of these people have not even considered that. They're like, oh, really? And I do that with people in leadership development. Like, Amy Edmondson has brilliant work about our relationship with failing. She has a new book called The Right Kind of Wrong. I met her through the inner development goals because we're both advisors, and I brought her in to do some work with Google, and that's a good example of a brilliant researcher who it's just not necessarily part of her context, right? But she actually started her career working with Buckminster Fuller.
Oh, really? Wow.
She was an engineer and assisted him. So she got her start with Bucky Fuller, and then she went on to she kind of shifted and got a PhD, and I can't remember what, but she now, teaches in the Harvard Business School and has published lots and lots of books about psychological safety, about failure, about leadership. She has a case study where she analyzes how did the Chilean mining rescue when miners got trapped under the rock. She's like, how did this seemed like an impossible challenge, an intractable challenge. Let's look at how they saved all those miners. And so now I'm working with her on, there seems to be some really important insights there that we can apply to people working in the climate space, because it's pretty darn intractable. And so she's really good at there's the role of humility, and there's the role of admitting when you don't know something. And so again, what I'm trying to say is there's all the mental health benefits of the solutions and regenerative future, and all the research exists that supports that. It's just really about bringing it together and joining the dots up a bit more. And frankly, I think the regenerative climate space needs to be reaching out much more to people outside of their disciplines, who may not even be thinking much about climate at all. Sooner or later, everyone's going to have to be.
Mm-hmm. Very
sooner
soon.
or later, Brene Brown will have to write a book about it.
Well, that would be amazing.
I'll do it first. You know what I mean? So.
I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, first of all, sooner or later, everyone is going to have to think about it. And this is where that, 5 to 7 year feedback of our Earth's natural system is going to rock, I think, everyone's world. I mean,
yeah.
I don't want to be overly, to me, this isn't fear. I'm not saying this from a space of fear. I'm saying this from a space of let's just look at the realities of what's happening last year and the year before.
Right.
We have 30 million plus people already affected by climate disaster.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
most of the world isn't even recognizing that. It's
right.
certainly not the highest emitting countries.
Uh-huh.
We're not even honoring what's already happening. And so when we get to the point where things get much, much worse,
mm-hmm.
Which is almost inevitable.
Yeah.
If we don't ground ourselves in that reality, I think that's where I think the problem is. It's not a fear-based, but we have to do that in order to find the resilience and to find the ways to mitigate that and get out of that to create that regenerative future. But that's going to be when everyone, and we're going to see Brene Brown write a book, and we're going to see many other folks be writing. Mm-hmm. Everyone's going to be focusing on that point, and it's going to have to.
Right. Again, I think the question is, what are the conditions that enable humans to face reality? That is literally what psychoanalysis is based on, by the way. I mean, literally, Freud started psychoanalysis with this fundamental question about, okay, how do we be with what is reality without splitting off into all of the defenses that we engage? He talked about the revolt of the mind against reality. He wrote about that in the 1800s, about this capacity we have to revolt against reality unless the conditions are conducive to facing it. And so, it can either come, you can be hit literally by a tsunami, or you can have engaged with the reality enough to have moved above ground and, started a eco industry. So it's going to find you regardless. But I think the question we need to be asking is what are those conditions for facing hard, complex truths? And it turns out people who do a lot of trauma work know a lot about that. And, I'm thinking about, hospicing modernity, Vanessa Machado de Oliveira, whose work is just so, I'm stunned how much I hear her work coming up by senior executives in companies. Okay. Like senior executives are aware of that work of hospicing modernity that she's introduced and now runs trainings. And so we are in it already. And what she's doing is basically feels like an expression of what I was experiencing in the late 80s when I was taking all those classes about, like, clearly this is not going to sustain. And we're living in a traumatized, outmoded world. And what do we do with that? And so that expression of hospicing modernity is one way of approaching that. But my point being that we need to be looking at how do we face what's hard. And that to me is more of an interesting question than whether we should scare people or not.
Yeah, no, I think that's really, really poignant. And, my mission, I mentioned this earlier, everyone thinks I'm the extreme optimist and I think that we're going to solve everything. And I think the inevitability of a regenerative future, yes. I think eventually humanity is going to get there. I think it's inevitable. But my goal is to make sure we create that regenerative future, the regenerative economy and society sooner than later, and to avoid too much of the trauma, too much of the Earth system's feedback, right? Reducing that. And so when people think and they respond to my work as like a solutionist, they think, oh, you think we're going to do 100% solve the system by 2030? I say, no. What I'm hoping to do is build enough 20 to 30% of the system to be regenerative. So they have models of regenerative businesses, communities, cities, and businesses all over the world to be enough of the system. So when these catastrophes happen, we must change, that there are models all over the world that we can go to. And we need to have a certain threshold of that. So how do we build up enough capacity within our system to take that shock and be able to adjust without too much disruption to people's quality of life, well-being, and health? And I think that's really what my ultimate goal is. And I think part of that is also, of course, how do we weave in our own psychological resilience to what's coming, and to make sure that we can be operating in a regenerative mindset and framework, and have enough of our system doing that. I don't think we're going to get 100% of humanity, ready and resilient and capable of doing that. But because that's part of the problem, though, is that oftentimes in our space, people want to have everybody 100% change, 100% be ready for 100% of the solutions. And that, I think, creates a sort of almost built-in defeatism. We can't do all that. But if we can ground ourselves in what we can actually do and how much of the system needs to be regenerative in order to take on those shocks, well, I think we have the makings of actually successfully making a transition. Renee, I honestly have so many more questions, and as often the case with us over the many chats that we've had, we can go on for hours and hours. But I do have to call it, I think, pretty soon. I have one more question that I ask all of my guests. And so we'll close with this one. And it's really about your vision of a regenerative future. And so when you think about a regenerative future, regenerative economy, regenerative society, a concept that obviously is so essential to what we're exploring here at Regenerative Intelligence, Regen Intel. What does that future look like in your mind? What is that vision of the future that you see? And
Mhm.
how is this vision informed by your understanding of psychology and human behavior? How does it differ from our current state of being on our planet?
Okay. Well, my vision is that, anyone working on behalf of regenerative future, my phrase that's coming up in my head is, it's a little woo-woo, but a light worker.
Okay.
So anyone working on the side of light. My vision is that these individuals, these groups are showing up as skillful guides and are have the wherewithal to foster the kinds of human interactions that are productive and lead to, unprecedented levels of creativity and love and connection and all of that. And so what that looks like is a lot of disparate gatherings and ways of humans coming together. But really, I want to talk about the leadership, what we talked about, people really seeing themselves as leaders in some way or another. And so the vision is that I could just say that people are guides, and this is what they're doing. They're attuning to themselves and to each other, and really listening and having this capacity to attune and hold space and all of that. There's telling the truth compassionately and skillfully. So there's a truth telling. There's equipping and providing people and each other with the resources, the tools that we need to be successful. Convening, people are convening in groups and settings to really foster that sense of we're in this, how are we going to navigate. And then sustain is that this work is sustainable, it's ongoing, there's momentum, it's not just like let's push for this one thing, and there's real sustainability and momentum that's built into all of this. And those are the 5 guiding principles of Project Inside Out: attune, reveal, equip, convene, and sustain. So that's what I see as the future. That's my future vision, is that this work is really just out and embedded, and expressed in all kinds of creative ways that I couldn't possibly imagine. That tap into, I should say, existing fundamental ancient wisdom. So am I going to tell Shirley what to do? No. Right? I'm not coming from that mindset. I'm talking about how do we create how do we unleash what the wisdom and knowledge that already is within the human race, basically, and allow that to really have full expression.
Beautiful. And aligned with the book that I'm planning on writing about regenerative knowledge systems, which we've talked about. We got to get our book writers club together.
Yeah.
Renee. Renee, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on My Climate Quest today. Your journey, your insights have been so incredibly enlightening, inspiring, and I know I feel energized and motivated, and I'm sure all of our listeners are going to feel that way as well, and carry that energy and that motivation throughout this year and beyond. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and your experience with us. It's absolutely a joy to speak with you today.
Thank you. Likewise.
And thank you all for joining us today. I'm thrilled to welcome you on My Climate Quest.
This podcast is brought to you by Regen Intel, a public benefit advisory and education platform training the next generation of leadership for a better planet, and co-produced and distributed by our incredible partners, Better Worlds, Soar Studios, and Shikonomy. Special thanks to Michael Katijian, aka Inverse K, for the incredible intro number for Season 3 of this podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with others. And to learn more about Regen Intel, check out our Foundations program at www.regenintel.com. www.regenintel.earth/education. Applications are accepted all year round. See you next time on Chad's Climate Quest.